Okay, guys. So congratulations on the film. It's certainly an interesting take on a story that I think we all sort of know. It was obviously a massive news story. So kind of to all three of you, how did you go about approaching this story in a way we haven't seen before?
We had really good sources. We had a great crime reporter called Duncan Campbell who gave me a thick transcript of all of the surveillance tapes that Scotland Yard had gathered. Scotland Yard had put the gang under heavy surveillance. So we started out with this document of all their conversations in this kind of mad criminal vernacular. That's what hooked me in, because that was so interesting and intriguing, and the kind of the currents and the riptides of what was going on intrigued me.
And obviously for you, you've done true crime with Mindhunter.
Yeah.
How was this different? I mean, obviously it's very different, but in what ways was it different for you as a writer?
Well, it's nowhere near as dark and claustrophobic, and Mindhunter was kind of vertiginous, and you sometimes felt quite ill dealing with serial killers. And the joy of this was that you didn't at all. It's a totally different thing, but what they had in common was that if you put real people under a microscope and examine everything that they say and do, it's often really fascinating. And James, being a documentary maker, it was a wonderful collaboration, because I love being able to sort of examine people.
The idea was always to make it as naturalistic as possible, to really try and show what happened. And when you do that, you knock into things that are really quite absurd and often quite funny. But our idea was to try and, this is how it was, this is how they did it, and this is what happened, and this is how they went about divvying up the loot very badly and with a great deal of sort of conflict. But that was always the idea, to try and show something about how it actually was. And if that becomes comedy, which in certain instances it just does,
yes,
then we need to embrace that too.
Yeah, I think the light-dark balance in this film is really interesting. It's almost a game of two halves, I guess, in that respect. And it's quite light early on.
So there's something at stake once they've got, as in any human, sort of undertaking, they acquire something that has enormous value, and that brings out the best in them, or the worst in them. Take your pick.
And what was that like for you as an actor to portray the different shades of these characters and the different ways in which your character interacts with the others, I guess?
Yeah, it was kind of, it was hard for me, I found it hard for me to know when we were filming it. I could never quite feel like a grasp of the tone. But I felt kind of okay with that. I think that seemed right in a weird kind of way. Like James says, that when you hear about this story, in and of itself, it's such an interesting story, and it lends itself so well to kind of a movie, or being dramatized in some way, that the best way you can serve it is just to tell it as truthfully as possible. And so when it came to Basil, it was about us making sure we all were on the same page about who we thought he was and what his role was, and then playing that as, putting that on screen as authentically as possible.
And I mean, Basil's very interesting because he remains something of an enigma even now. So I guess for all three of you, that specific character, kind of how was that approached, and how did you guys work with the fact that we don't really know who he is?
Well, I came on at a time when there was already a script that kind of gave me everything I needed. And the conversation that I remember discussing with James and Joe was to make sure we found a way of explaining that he was someone who was capable of getting them in the vault and dealing with the alarm systems and having the knowledge to do the things that he does to make this robbery possible. But also remembering the fact that he's for whatever reason, he's involving a team of people, or at least he's involving Brian Reeder, who is 50 years his senior or something. So why, just not that we ask or answer this question, but just kind of remind ourselves that he doesn't have a couple of mates he can go to for whatever reason. So just making sure that there's something strange enough about him to explain why he doesn't do this with a team of thieves his own age.
We knew from the transcripts that there was something different about Basil because of the way that they talked about him. And we couldn't quite put our finger on what it was, but there was a kind of odd respect, but also a strange kind of distance that they kept from him. And it seemed a much more compelling approach than the more hackneyed idea that he was the kingpin or he was the kind of mysterious leader. To us, it started to look more and more likely that he was, in some ways, a dupe, you know, or a mixture of both, which is reality. That's certainly what came out of the transcripts.
I guess sort of finally, was there a joy, I guess for all three of you, but perhaps especially you, James, in taking respected British thespians, you know, Michael Caine, Jim Broadbent, and having them squeezing through vaults and shouting the C word at each other?
Well, it was a joy for them in that, I think, so, not just for me. And that was what's so great about the collaboration with the actors. It was an ensemble piece with these extraordinary actors, and you didn't have to do much, you know, with actors of that caliber and that kind of ingenuity. Just let them go. And I always make the analogy that they're like a jazz band that come and they improv as well as do the numbers. And it was
a jazz band with C-bombs.
Indeed, and you know, because the dialogue was all pretty much inspired by what we knew how these people spoke, that's how they speak. And so it involved lots of swearing and abuse, you know, across from each other. But it wasn't something we made up. That's how those guys spoke, and our actors very happily embraced that demotic speech of those kind of guys in that age and that class.
Was it sort of a shock for you, seeing these guys you've seen on screen for years, letting loose and being pretty rough?
You know, I never got over the shock. I was allowed in a room with them. You know what I mean?
No, me neither.
You know,
I would drink these people.
So that, you know, that I have, you know, I think of some of the days on set with those guys, and I don't think I'll ever. I think I've said to James Mayton, I think it'll be the highlight of my life, probably. It was an absolute pleasure to be there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Tom.
Congratulations on the film. It's been great to speak to you.